Welcome to the first audio session of our new normal opportunities and risk series. So let's provide some context. I think we'd all agree we're really living through a period of unprecedented change. The world has spun on its axis. And what makes this so challenging to me is this change is really omnipresent. It feels like we're living in a permanent state of flux. You know, the consumer landscape has changed fundamentally. And businesses across the retail, food, beverage and leisure industries are in the eye of the storm. They have to adapt to thrive and survive. Organisations require new approaches and solutions to manage the opportunities and risks created by the new normal. In the coming weeks, I'm going to be discussing 6 key areas with Marsh and McLennan risk experts, focusing on supporting risk and insurance professionals to help prepare for the longer-term implications of the structural shift to the new normal, while also building resilience to any short-term shocks. So we're going to cover some macro topics, including safety, digitisation, mental health, business forecasting, and also dip into the insurance market, which is also going through generational change with a specific focus on property and directors and officers' liability risks. So today, I'm going to focus on safety first with our head of operational risk, Darren Holmes. I think we'd all agree consumer-facing businesses have to convince consumers first about creating a safe brand and environment, and the same is true for employees. Only when safety credibility is built can high street firms really begin to start competing and differentiating with their products and services. It's fair to say, never before has safety been so mission critical and so visible front of house. So Darren, let's explore what you're seeing on the front line. Now, what do you think are the key lessons you've seen high street firms learn when building their safety propositions?
Thank you, David. I think that, as you've already mentioned, the shift and the constant changing of the landscape around COVID-19 and what that means for hospitality, leisure, retail, food and drink, etc., is forever sort of seems out of reach at the moment. And I think that the guidelines that are provided both by regulators and the government seem to be shifting on a daily basis. I think that what's really important about some of the positive lessons that we've learned is really about how organisations keep ahead of those and what they're actually doing. So I think that we've seen organisations, high street firms, I think we've seen them really focus in on making sure that they are consistent in their approach, that they provide a targeted structure within the organisation that allows them to communicate effectively within the business to make sure that the workforce and the customers and consumers are aware of what it means to them, and really just trying to drive that messaging from the very beginning and make sure that it's consistent. So I think the key lessons are keeping abreast of government guidelines. I think that's absolutely fundamental. I think that's hard for organisations because it is constantly changing, but I think something that they absolutely need to do. I think linking into industry bodies, we've seen some great evidence of where industry bodies have provided some clarity and clarification over best practice and what different high street organisations can do to discharge their duty, either, as I say, from government guidelines or from regulation. So I think industry bodies are a really, really good place to start. I think maintaining social distancing is not always as simple as it might sound. It's quite interesting that we've been doing some work with some organisations just recently, looking at pinch points within those organisations, and really trying to strike that balance between resourcing and servicing customer needs and capacity and actually trying to maintain that social distancing. And I think that there are some real challenges, and those challenges are very unique to hospitality, leisure, retail, food and drink manufacturing, all have their own challenges around that. So I think that's I think that we're learning a lot more around that as we go on. And I've seen some great examples of where retailers have really come up with some innovative ways to keep people flowing through the door whilst maintaining that social distancing and keeping safe. I think for retailers, it's a huge issue, because as one of the things that we try and do is one-way systems, for example. But in a retail environment, people want to stop and browse, and whilst retailers have increased the aisle space between different, clothing sort of like rails or food rails and food counters, it's really, really hard because people want to stop and browse. So how do you maintain that in a retail setting? And we've seen some innovative ways of doing that just by encouraging people to look away, making sure that people, turn their back, perhaps seen as being rude, but what it does allow organisations to do is operate in a way which is going to get the best experience for their customers. And I don't think we should forget that. The whole customer experience, the theatre that retailers are trying to create, we need to try and maintain that in a COVID world, and that's really, really hard. So again, finding new sort of innovative ways to do that is absolutely key. I think I've already mentioned effective communication, and I'd like to just sort of go back to that. I think that nominating somebody within the organisation to be that key coordinator of all communication and knowledge within the business is a cornerstone of success around that COVID management. It focuses the daily sort of changes and the inputs from regulators, from government into one person, and enables them to interpret that and drive that as a consistent standard across the business. And on my final point, I really just wanted to mention around monitoring and maintaining standards of control. We've seen some great examples of where retailers in particular have really stepped up on how to ensure those standards of control within their environment. I was talking to a retailer just last Friday, and what they were doing is they make announcements over their tannoy system every 20 minutes to let people know the importance of making sure that they're socially distancing within the store. So just saying, just checking the person next to you, are you standing 2 meters apart? And that's a really great way to do it. There's another point around that, which is about evidencing it. I think we've had a lot of talk around what that might mean for potential claims within the casualty piece moving forward, particularly under public liability, but also employers' liability. And again, we've seen some great creative ways that organisations, hospitality and leisure in particular, have managed that through using clips of CCTV footage as evidence that they're maintaining social distancing within the workplace.
Thanks, Darren. And picking up on that point regarding almost like appointing a project manager to direct or channel all that content through, what do you think is probably the best sort of practice you've seen as an infrastructure sitting below that kind of key pinch point?
I think, so for me, it's about making sure that somebody in the organisation with a level of authority is actually acting as that project manager. They've got the authority to be able to drive that information out into the business, and that it will be understood and implemented. I have seen some poor examples of where somebody has just been nominated as that role, yet they don't have the authority to be able to drive through the changes within the business. Where I've seen it very effective is where individual, as I say, health and safety manager, operations manager in retail, deputy manager or shift manager, where they're taking the responsibility, shift handover books that actually catch the information to make sure that it's consistently communicated in next shift. Very relevant within food and drink manufacturing, for example. So I think that there's lots of examples of good practice that I've seen. What I would say is make sure that what you're doing is right for your business. One size absolutely does not fit all. And I think it's important that you reflect on that and look at your business, how your business operates, look at the operating space and the environment in which you're working, and think about what works for you, not what everybody else is doing. I think that's really important. What I'd also say on that, David, is start with this process of risk assessment. I'm sure we'll come on to that a little bit later when we talk about regulatory challenges. But I think that risk assessment is absolutely fundamental within this process. And whilst communication is part of this, so is risk assessment in understanding what that communication is, what the message is that you're sending out, how it's sent out, and also how it's monitored and maintained within the business. So how it's endorsed within the organization.
Yeah, that's a key point. And going back to your kind of focus on defensibility, you know, it's almost as though you need to be taking a snapshot at a point in time of everything that's been done from a risk assessment perspective, because things, as you say, are moving so quickly. So again, going back to my kind of question around best practice, you know, what's the best sort of practice around keeping track of activities and risk processes at each point of the chain?
Well, to be honest with you, there is a requirement to make sure that you track the recommendations and the implementation of your processes as you go. So you do need a physical sort of document that actually captures all of the government guidelines, that captures all of the regulatory guidelines. And then alongside with that document, you should be noting down what you're doing within the organization to fulfill the requirement of that guidance or that regulation. So essentially creating a register of guidance and regulation in this new normal, I think is absolutely key. What does that look like? You might want to use Excel, you might want to use Word, you might want to do it on a pen and paper, but I certainly would encourage having some type of list of all of the regulation, all of the guidance, and then what you've done. The other really key point around that, David, and I think that you're raising a really good point around this. The other really important thing is making sure that you track what you're doing as the regulations change. So where we had a set of guidance in July, for example, the guidance now is slightly different, making sure that you've still got evidence of what you've done in July, but you've also got evidence about what you've done now to make sure that you're fully complying with that. Keeping those records and maintaining those records is absolutely crucial, because if you do have intervention by the Environmental Health Office, the Health and Safety Executive, they will look for examples about what you've done previously and how that's been amended. And they will look for evidence to be able to demonstrate that you've discharged your duty of care. And I think it's important to also know that your duty, that under the guidance that's provided by government, that is not the law. However, it is seen as best practice, and it's important that you can evidence that you have fulfilled that claim to defensibility.
Well, I mean, that's a brilliant suggestion. I really like the idea of running that twin track where you've got a regulatory change, you've got your evidence, and you're bringing it together. I think that's a brilliant suggestion. And going back onto that theme around sort of distribution centres, you know, distribution centres, food manufacturing plants. I mean, it doesn't seem that the day goes by at the moment without there being some sort of press coverage around the business being impacted. You know, in that kind of, and you mentioned social distancing, you know, it's very difficult to do that in certain environments. But you know, any top tips that you've seen businesses implement around social distancing in that confined space environment?
No, well, so I think that probably the key thing that organizations are trying to do is implement a one-way system. My top sort of tip around that is actually making sure that you understand what the capacity of your organization is. You recognize and identify where the pinch points are early within the process before you start increasing any capacity within the business. So things like putting arrows on the floor indicating that the path of travel is really important. There is nothing worse than, you know, you've got a dedicated walkway that you've created social distancing away from desks or from in loading bays, for example, particularly in distribution, you know, where you've got people walking one way and when people are walking the other way and they're crossing within a distance of less than 2 meters is really frustrating. So trying to create those one-way systems within the workplace is absolutely key. And I would certainly recommend it as best practice. But like I also said, is thinking about where the pinch points are within the business. So as a logistics centre, I use this as an example, particularly where you've got third parties coming onto the site. They might pull up to the main office to collect their load, etc. There might be other people that are waiting in the office to collect their loads for distribution, etc. So you can end up in those types of pinch points of having lots of people in a very, very confined area. So thinking about what does that look like? So I've seen organisations that have a notification process where a distribution driver pulls up, they notify at the gatehouse that they've arrived, they wait in their cab until they are notified by the warehouse manager that they can come in, and then they come in, they agree to all of the paperwork, then they go back and wait in their cab. However, what's really important, let's not forget the importance of safety in all of this. A big challenge in transport and logistics at the moment is about reducing the number of fatalities to do with vehicles. And whilst it's a good idea to have people waiting in their cabs for their load to be placed, the other important thing is making sure that the system that you put in doesn't contradict other safety systems that you have in place. And an example of that is making sure that you hold on to the keys of the driver so the driver can't pull away from the loading bay before their load has been fully loaded, a common cause of injury within that sector. So I think that, top tips are, sort of lane markings on the ground, giving direction of travel, reducing access to certain areas, using spare officers as rest areas, particularly in haulage and for distribution. So if you've got an office space or a meeting room that's not being used because of COVID-19, could that be sort of reused as a rest area for drivers or even warehouse staff to try and minimize the collection of, the gathering of people in small distances?
Great. Now, just kind of sticking with that theme of safety, looking at the future, and unfortunately, we are heading into, if we're not, already in a deep recession. An impact on that is undoubtedly going to be a societal shift potentially, and clients who have lots of colleagues who are on the high street, in a retail environment. Workplace violence is probably a sad indictment of society, but we're probably going to see that increase. Again, any thoughts here on how businesses can support colleagues in that kind of challenging environment?
Yeah, I think it's a absolutely vital area that we need to cover. I think too often we perhaps don't feel comfortable sort of discussing this matter, but it's a sad fact of where we are within COVID-19 that we have seen cases of violence and abuse in retail and hospitality staff increase more than 50% higher than they were pre-COVID. I think it should be a real focus. I don't think it's just the retail sector. I think that hospitality, leisure, I think those areas that this plays to as well. And I think coupled with the fact that sort of recent studies have also suggested increases in anxiety amongst workers. A recent study that I read suggested a 76% increase in anxiety amongst workers because they were because of the interaction that they were having with customers, and that was linked back to sort of concerns around violence that organisations can do. And I would focus those particularly around retail, hospitality and leisure, or an industry where again, it might be pertinent. For me, I think there's three areas to focus on. I think training. I think training for the employee on how to deal with conflict, how to deal with an abusive customer or a violent customer. So I think those practical skills in trying to calm down situations, I think is absolutely key. I would also sort of encourage training at different levels within the organisation. I think it's important to do that training for frontline staff, but I think also training for managers about dealing with intervening in situations which seem to be escalating. I think that's really, really important. I think there's also that issue around training. Let's not forget the impact of how abuse can make individuals feel and the impact of that on their mental health. So I think that training around, some simple things around what the organisation has in place to support good mental health within their workforce, but also again for managers about how do you identify that somebody may be suffering from poor mental health? What are the signs to look for? So training, I think, is absolutely key. There are some great courses out there online. There's a load of free content that's available that organisations can tap into. And I would really encourage that. I think it's taken a huge focus over the last month since COVID-19. So I would really encourage some of the great content that's been made publicly available by organisations sharing some of the best practice that they do is again absolutely key around this. I think that often we sort of, it becomes challenged. I think this comes back to another point that I made earlier. It's about how do we manage our daily sort of our daily work tasks and daily environment, but now we're having to manage that in the shadow of the pandemic as well. And those two can sometimes cause some conflict. And an example of that would be where you've got less capacity to service your customers, therefore you need less staffing to be able to service them, and therefore you may have less supervision available. And for organisations that are perhaps smaller high street retailers or smaller leisure and hospitality companies that don't have the luxury of expensive CCTV footage to be able to provide that remote supervision, but making sure that you've got that in a physical perspective as well. So I think supervision is absolutely key around that, to be able to monitor to monitor the environment. The third point I really wanted to make was around support and monitoring of employee welfare. And that's really about that tertiary intervention that you do at the end. So, how are your employees? How are they coping? Again, I was talking to a retailer only 2 weeks ago who had seen a significant increase in employee welfare, in poor employee mental health, due to them being exposed to abuse. And it's interesting because the abuse, I think, often comes from the frustration that's caused. I'm having to wait for a table, and I can't get to the area of the store that I want to because people are standing in the way and I'm trying to maintain social distancing. And I think that COVID-19 has taken its toll on everyone to some extent, to a lesser or more extent. But I think that as we continue forward, I think it's important to be able to monitor that in that operational setting, and also consider accumulatively how that impacts employees, not just on a daily basis, but cumulatively over a period of time. How is that impacting employees? The level of stress as it continues to stretch further and further and further over 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, starts to take its toll. So I think it's really important that employers really focus in on that support and monitoring, not just now, but in the future, and make sure that they've got those processes in place to support those employees in the future when they actually need support and help. I did just want to add on that as well, David. I think some really good practice that I've seen, and I've seen it quite a significant increase in this in the retail, hospitality and leisure centre, and that is in leisure industry. I've seen a real focus on organisations being clearer on their policy around a zero tolerance to violence, abusive behaviour towards members of staff. And I think that is I think that what we've got to do is we've got to be, we want to be clear about what that message is. I think we have to be careful to say that we do not tolerate. And I think that this is again, I want to really talk about it from a best practice perspective and what I've seen as best practice. I've seen signs that say we do not tolerate abusive behaviour towards our staff. I think that that can sometimes be seen as ambiguous about what is the tolerance level. So I would encourage people to take a zero tolerance policy towards abusiveness towards their staff, and make sure that I think that gives a clear and unambiguous message. And I think that it also promotes customer and colleague confidence, that the employer is looking after them, but also the customers, from a customer perspective, that they feel safe as well, that they're not exposed to that type of behaviour.
Sure. Great, great insight there, Darren. And picking up on that point regarding sort of intervention and training, we've seen parts of the industry who've experienced huge kind of growth regarding certain aspects of their business, kind of the move to digitization and online delivery. And I think the challenge there has been onboarding so many people in such a short space of time and training. So going back to your point, there really does need to be a very sound infrastructure to support the onboarding of new colleagues. And then kind of the other sort of polar kind of opposite in the industry is having lots of employees are on furlough. And your point there around how do you support those colleagues, because let's not forget they're still technically employed, and there is an obligation for the business to keep that interaction with those individuals. Any thoughts on that kind of supporting furloughed kind of colleagues through this period?
Yeah, I think that the key thing for me is keeping in touch. Just because an employee is furloughed, exactly to your point, David, they are still an employee of yours, and therefore you still have a duty of care towards that individual. And I think that is a really, really important point. So I think that setting up systems and processes that enable you to keep contact. I've seen some great examples of where organizations have set up WhatsApp groups for furloughed workers, just to keep in touch with them and let them know what's going on within the business. I've seen examples of where they've set up individual sort of like staff Twitter accounts so people can communicate effectively. I've seen great use of things like Zoom, so running things like quiz nights or quiz sessions where they're encouraging fellow staff to just continue to be part of the organization. So I think that I've seen some really, really great innovation. I know that there's a lot of organizations out there that have grown phenomenally through this period of COVID. Zoom being, video conference being an organization that has absolutely grown hugely since the start of this. Where I think it's been really effective is how organizations have taken those tools and actually driven them through and applied them within their teams and workforce to be able to keep that connection, keep that motivation, keep people positive. So I think that's really, really important. I think it's also really important to make sure that we highlight and sort of really bring to the forefront some of the employee benefits that we have in place within the organization. So you might have an employee advisory program. Now is the time when employees are furloughed, is to make sure that employees are aware of what that employee advisory program telephone number is. If you have a mental health strategy in place within your organization, again, reiterating who the mental health first aiders are and that they're available if somebody wants to talk to them. I've seen some great examples where some short 5-minute bites of mental health awareness have been sort of like rolled out through Zoom to employees that are furloughed. So I think that organizations have been really, really innovative about the way that they've kept contact and kept that company spirit together, and I'd encourage that even moving forward from this point. It's still an incredibly challenging time, and I do think that it is. We have seen examples of where it's really taken its toll on certain individuals. It doesn't take much to just, as a manager, just to set up a WhatsApp group for all of your employees of your store or your leisure facility or, of your hotel, etc. And just, even if it's just once a week, just sort of reaching out and just saying, just checking in, making sure you're all okay. I'm here if you need me. Now, as a manager, we have a duty of care towards employees. And I think that sometimes is, particularly in the process of furlough, we've sort of perhaps some ways lost sight of that. But I do think that if we look at it from a regulatory point of view, managers have a responsibility, legally, to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of their employees. So I think it's an important factor, not only from the well-being and commitment of the organisation moving forward, but also from a regulatory point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel that, that point regarding contact and regular contact with management and being kept in touch with the firm is absolutely pivotal. We share some great insights. Thank you for the discussion and sharing your knowledge today, Darren. Hopefully everyone's found this webcast to be really useful, and we really look forward to welcoming you to forthcoming sessions. Next thing in the series really will be to focus on the cyber landscape. I think everyone will agree a key part of the new normal is a permanent shift to online and the automation of everything. So we look forward to welcoming you to that audio cast. Thank you. Thanks again, Darren.
Thank you.